Okay, Josh, thank you very much for joining me on the Screw Space podcast today. What we will be discussing is all about the consent management journey. Now, that will all make sense once Josh gives a little bit of an introduction to himself. But yes, Josh, please could you just let the audience know a little bit about yourself, if that's okay?
Perfect, Nick. Appreciate it. So, yeah, so I'm Joshua. I'm heading up the global and strategic accounts here at Didomi. We're a consent management solution provider. But a bit about me and how I got to this point. So, I've been in sales, in sort of compliance or GRC in general for the better part of a decade now. So, really starting off from sort of a core sales perspective, and now sort of edging more, hopefully, into more business advisory as well as that commercial output. But really, what I've been able to observe is, in essence, the evolution of consent in that time period, from sort of its first flushings of GDPR, sort of 2016, 2017, all the way through to today, where, and we'll cover this off in some detail, the sort of the hyper complexity and the sort of the moving goalposts, if you will, in relation to consent and consent management in general.
Okay.
That's kind of me in a nutshell.
Perfect. Okay, so just before we get into it, then, obviously I know that you work for Didomi. What actually is the problem that you guys actually solve then?
Yeah. So in essence, what we've got to say, Nick, is that there is, like I said, a multiplicity of consent bases to solve for. So, and what I mean by that is, consent, it comes in many different shape and forms, right? And we're talking about from sort of a digital perspective, your interaction with your end user. Yeah. And in that regard, what you've got is you've kind of got three stages, right? So we call this sort of the consent life cycle, or the consent journey, right? And in essence, what you've got is the front end interaction. So most people recognize that from the sort of the pop-ups that you get, the cookie banners, right? And what that's doing is that's managing your third party basis of consent. So for third party vendors, that comes in the form of tags, cookies, pixels, beacons. In essence, anything that a third party is dropping on your site for some sort of data sharing purpose, right? And in that regard, we're all used to like GDPR pop-in banners, but there are different methods of consent depending on where you exist in the world. So is it an opt-in basis? Is it an opt-out? Or is it a combination of the two? Right, and lots of different regions have taken a different approach to solving this problem. The US is very different to the sort of Eurozone, for example, right? The next stage of sort of the consent journey, if you will, is in essence, okay, I've been to your site several times. Let's use an example. Decathlon, I'm buying some clothing, right? So you go to the Decathlon site, the banner pops up, you make your decisions around consent, etc. And then you go to, okay, well, now I'm an identified user. And at that point, then what you're going to do is I'm going to provide some details about myself. And moreover, I'm going to say, okay, I want you to send me an email. I don't want you to send me an email. I want you to email me about these products. I want you to communicate on X, Y, and Z. Now, most of us as end users and consumers just perceive that as some sort of flow or part of the journey that we go on. But actually, that's a consent. I'm electively saying, I give you the right to be able to communicate to me on these topics. And that can go very, very narrow, or it can go very broad, depending on what products you're selling, what services, additional services you want to offer, or what you want to do with that information. So everybody talks about utilizing customer data. Without consent, it's useless. So it's kind of the main starting point, the entry point to then being able to have usable data in terms of identified user. And then the last portion of that consent journey really is, okay, I no longer want to buy clothing, or I don't want to buy snowboards or whatever it might be from Decathlon, if we use that example. I need to be able to have proof of how you've collected my data. I need you to provide me a copy and show how you've stored my data. And I need you to provide me a copy, show me proof of that information, and then delete it if I so deem that that's what I want to do. So that has evolved over the last 10 years that I've been able to observe it. And it's only becoming more complicated from a global perspective.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. And a couple of things that I just wanted to pick your brains on before we kind of go into jumping it down a little bit. You mentioned right at the end a little bit about how it's kind of changed quite a lot in the past 10 years.
Mm.
Just explain what you meant by that then. How's that changed?
Yeah, so I mean, prior to sort of GDPR, it was a little bit of sort of the Wild West in terms of it was a free for all, right? There were no real standards or sort of regulatory bodies really making heads or tails of how people should behave appropriately. GDPR then came in. There was a lot of fear initially. People have kind of gotten used to that standard. There are other sort of standards as well that help support that. Things like the IAB's TCF, whether I think it's perfect or not, it's an industry standard for how you manage sort of the cookie banner side of things. And then what's happened since then is other countries have sort of twigged that actually their consumers are quite concerned about how their data is being handled. I think we've seen that from a lot of sort of the class action lawsuits that we've seen with the likes of Meta, that we've seen with the likes of Google. And so really nation states are now understanding and realizing that the end user gives a damn about what happens to their personal information.
Yeah.
And we're actually starting to see now that there is a sort of this development of sort of a trust reservoir now between organizations. And actually, you can see Apple have done some marketing recently around making sure that privacy is something that you're aware of as a consumer that they're focusing on, right?
Mm.
And in terms of how that's grown, you've now got different standards in terms of regions. So you've got GDPR, and then you've got nuances within that from the variances in France to the variances in Italy to Germany. Then you've got standards in new standards in Canada that have just been passed. You've got CCPA, CPRA. You've even got talks about sort of a global privacy program. So a POPIA in South Africa, you've got LGPD in South America. So I can use a lot of acronyms, but hopefully that's sort of eliciting the idea that actually it's growing and there are more standards and there will be more standards and there will be evolutions of those standards in the next years to come.
You'd be fantastic at a game of Scrabble, Josh. Let me tell you
Yeah.
that with all them acronyms. But yeah, no. So fantastic, great point. So, um, I also just wanted to kind of final question before we jump into it is I'm curious as to how the standards differ on a geographical standpoint as opposed to like political standpoints as well. Because obviously I know with I spoke to another early stage vendor I think it was a couple of weeks ago now, and they have like a Gen AI product for the legal sector, and I sort of spoke to them and said like, okay, what's that your go to market strategy? Are you sort of like looking to expand into the US market sort of in 2025 and said like, do you know what? No. We said, we're absolutely happy with the European market. It's big enough. And with how our product works with sort of data security, it would have the product would have to change quite a lot to sort of be adaptable to the US market. And it made sense. So what's your view on that? How does it differ sort of on a geographical standpoint?
Yeah. So just covering off the US actually, because to be honest with you, the sort of the Eurozone has been covered to death in terms of privacy and compliance. The US actually represents quite an interesting sort of place and a discussion point on this. But in a nutshell, a lot of the global regions have not had really anything in the way of consistent, easily accessible, easily understandable, and easily enforceable regulation around sort of these sort of privacy standards, right? But the US is now accelerating into a world where actually there's going to be a lot of complexity in the US. For us, we've actually designed our solution to be able to augment to pretty much any standard. And I mentioned earlier on that with consent, nominally most people view it around cookies. So if we talk about it from that perspective for a minute, if we say that, okay, you've got an opt-in, opt-out, or a combination of the two. So either you say, I choose to sell my data, for example, yep, or I choose not to sell my data. There's like a restriction, as in the starting point is you either have access to my information and I say, okay, I want to take that back, or you have no access to my information and I grant you access to the bits that I'm okay with. So those are sort of the bases of consent, but then each state, for example, in the US is going to have totally different appreciation, nuance, configuration. There's 20 different privacy laws in the
Mm.
US, right, at this moment in time, and that's only going to grow, right? Hopefully, and we've been talking about this for a very long time in the industry, hopefully we'll get to something that looks like maybe a sort of a standardized standard, a global standard. That's kind of what GPP is meant to be. But yeah, in terms of from our world, from the consent world, we're ready for the complexity globally and that variance. And I do think personally the space to watch next year and then probably the next 2 years is going to be the US, because it's going to explode with privacy laws.
Okay. Okay. Really good to know. So let's go on a little bit of a journey then through the consent management system, the consent management life cycle. So obviously I know you've kind of mentioned that it sort of split up into 3 parts, but let's sort of like chunk down on that a little bit. So obviously the first part is obviously obtaining the consent then.
Mm.
How is that actually set into action then? How does a company or a website or a vendor, whatever it might be, how do they go about obtaining consent firstly?
Yeah, so good question. So the considerations that they'll need to take first are, what does our existing customer flow look like? Where are the entry points, right? Because the moment somebody enters your ecosystem from a digital perspective, you need to be considering, okay, the first gate is consent, right? They have to pass through some sort of consent interaction, be that through the sort of the cookie banner, if you will, right? So as Europeans, we're used to this. So if you've got any sort of global sort of viewers for the pod, they will probably go, well, okay, that might not be my first interaction. That will change very soon. It's pretty much the case for everywhere. So you're going to have that configuration of, okay, from a consent perspective, which vendors, i.e., which solutions that I'm using as an organization, am sort of, are the end user okay accepting? Okay, so the configuration comes normally through a toggle system or some sort of acceptance system, right? So it'll be, am I okay with Google sharing some of the information? Because actually most people aren't aware that when you go onto a site, you are sharing your data with potentially thousands of other organizations, right? So you can either go through it from a purpose level. What I mean by purposes is as defined by a standard. So normally people would understand that like, do I want to have my data used to help optimize for advertising? Do I want my information to be used so that I can run the necessary elements of this site, be it loading videos, etc. Right? So you can do it at a purpose level,
Yeah.
or you can do it at a vendor level. So you say, I specifically don't want Google to have access. I don't want Meta to have access. And so you can and should be able to curate in that fashion,
Yeah.
all the way to the point of, okay, now I've done that, I'm gonna save this sort of bespoke process. And what that should do is then that should act as a blocker, active blocker, so that when you return to that site, that it remembers those settings, right? If you clear your cache and cookies, obviously you have to go through that again. One of the other things as well that we also offer that's helpful is being able to manage consent across different devices, so that you're not having to constantly have that blocking experience every time. So it's, again, considering the entry points and making sure that you load that first point of consent. So that's point number one for consent entry. The secondary bit is then when I become identified. So my rights, so to speak, are perceived differently when I'm identified. Right. So the moment you know who I am, there's a whole set of other things that you need to consent for. Now, I oversimplified it by saying it's just for email or sort of marketing consents, right? You could have cross business functions. You might have a group. So we deal with lots of large organizations, right? And you say you have multiple brands. For you to be able to electively share that information across all those different brands, you need to get my permission. You need to say yes or no. So creating some sort of feature or function either embedded into your emails as a part of a workflow to get yourself confirmed as a user, or as part of a account setting function, right, is normally the way that most organizations will go
Mm.
to get that. So those are the primary sort of methods. But really, to think about consent, you have to think, where does the customer enter in their journey? The moment they enter is the moment you should start considering what data are we collecting, and therefore what consent do we need.
Okay. Okay. That's interesting. And a question on that is, um, Why would, because obviously there is a choice, isn't it? It's I'm trying to remember also the cookie page when sort of entering a website. It's like
Mm,
accept all cookies or accept like non-essential cookies.
mm.
And then I think, like you said, sometimes the wording change or it's just decline. Um, Sometimes when you decline cookies, are you then not allowed on the website? Or can you still can you still gain access to that website?
That's a good question. So when you're declining, what you're doing is you're saying, I decline to that portion of function,
Okay.
right, pertaining to that vendor. So it's a complicated one because, and actually, this is again something that we talk about with some of our customers when they're managing this. Is somebody may say, I've I've watched a Netflix documentary on how evil Meta is, right? And I want to block it, right? Because I don't want Mark Zuckerberg getting hold of my information anymore. Sorry, Mark. And you then go into the site and you go, oh, hang on a minute, this embedded function widget video, right? Let's use YouTube's probably better. So I block YouTube, yeah. I then see there's an embedded video that then has a requirement to say, well, you need to ask for consent again. Now, either one or two things will happen here. If you block YouTube at a vendor level and say, I don't want YouTube to have any of my information, when you get to that embed, yeah, that video, it will just have a gray box and it will show nothing. So you've lost the service because you've had to make the decision between, do I want to have this video and share all my information with YouTube or do I not? Yeah. Now, some organizations get around that by having a paywall so that in essence the idea is if we all paid for the internet when it first came out, we paid $25 each, we wouldn't have any of this advertising nonsense, right? But so in essence, we're going back to that idea. But if I decide to reject a specific vendor or I decide to reject a specific function, if it ties to something that's on the site that has to work, has to be turned on for it to work, then it just won't work. It won't be that you're denied access, you just won't get access to that material because you've made that sacrifice, you've made that payoff, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And is this primarily advertising where this data is trying to go to? Is it primarily trying to get to tailored ads to try and get them a revenue stream? Is that why these marketing sort of functions are trying to get sort of a slot on these websites? Is that the reason, or is it not as simple as that?
It's part of the reason. Yeah, I think when we try and describe it, it's very much a case of you know organizations want to have as much information as possible because they want to create a profile of you. They want to understand your buying habits. They want to understand how long you stay on a page. They want to understand, how many times you click the button. They want to understand if you abandoned a cart. They want to, they want to be able to do X, Y, and Z. But they also, especially if they're publishers, or they rely on something called programmatic revenue, which in essence is revenue generated by advertising. So if you've got, for example, Hello Magazine, yep, you'll have the banner ads running down the side. Now, an organization will have to, in essence, bid for the right to be able to put their advertising on the site, right? And the way in which that function works is if you understand, how much traffic I get to a site, if I understand, maybe to a degree the demographic or the areas they click on and the interests that they have, I can start in essence curating that biddable space to the advertisers. And if it's more curated, I can ask for more money. And so there was an argument to say some of it's to do with advertising, some of it's to do with just pure function, and it's just the requirement of how things operate. Whether that's right or wrong is irrelevant, just the state that we exist in. An organization like Google, seem like I'm picking on them, but Google Google go for a lot. I just want as much information as possible about the end user, about identified, unidentified users, and what's happening on the web, right? And for them, it's not necessarily just pure advertising; it's more about business intelligence. And realistically, what we try and tell organizations and more broadly general Joe public is organizations are making money off of your data,
Yeah.
which you are willingly giving away for free for the sake of watching an embedded video about two dogs playing in a puddle, right? You've got to start making that way and sort of that informed, balanced view of do I want it? Am I okay with that? Am I okay with that? Am I okay with sharing all my information so I get free access to something? Because ultimately that's what it comes down to is
Mm.
do I want to share that information to access to something for free because that company now makes money either from advertising or from sharing a very small fragment of my details about who I am and what I do to a
Mm.
bigger organization, which might ultimately end up utilizing that to make money as well.
It sounds like education's a big key part of this
Yeah.
because I don't think people, the general public, don't know what they're clicking on. It's just like, oh, because like we're in this sort of snapshot culture where we're doom scrolling on our phones, and you like you say you just want to watch that video, and it's like, oh, just move this page. We don't actually know what we're clicking on, what we're giving away when we're sort of saying like, oh, accept all cookies or something like that. We don't know what it's sort of leading to, and is that sort of part of the mission for you guys? Is actually an educational piece as opposed to actually saying like, look, we can help you out. Like you actually have to do the front end bits. Like, look, do you actually realize why you need this product?
Yeah, no, Nick, look, I mean, look, I'm in sales, so I can't say it's all for altruism, right? There's a risk and reward for me that's very clear. But one of the things I do like about the company I work for at the moment, Didomi, is that you know we're not on a crusade because it's not. We can never say that we charge for our services. If we're on a crusade, we might give it away for free. Um, but one of the things we do advise our customers, and we do feel quite passionate about, is you know trying to develop a sense of trust by doing the right things. The end user, so you and I, right, when we go and buy a consumer good, we can go online and very quickly determine whether or not we think this is a good or bad organization in terms of how
Mm.
they behave, right? And so we're more informed than we have ever been. So trying to treat the end user like they're a moron is not a good way to go anymore. So realistically, what we're trying to say is, look, you need to play by the rules because the rules are important because the rules make sure that the end user is protected in instances where maybe they're not as educated about X, Y, and Z. Yeah. The likelihood is they do know a bit and they know enough to get annoyed. And if they get annoyed, they're going to lose trust. And if they lose trust, there is going to be another vendor that does the same thing, offers the same service, and is able to put their hand up and go, hey, we're doing a better job and you can trust us. Here's all the good stuff that we're doing. So really you can't ignore it anymore. It's not even just about the fines. The end user, the you and I, the Joe on the street, can very easily find out if you're behaving in the right way. And actually that's really, really important in the digital
Mm.
world that we live in, is that once that's published online that you've not done things fairly, very, very hard to come back from that. And so what we're trying to do is help organizations manage that the best way possible with solutions. Yeah.
Mm.
So that they can say, look, we are playing by the rules, we're doing the right thing, and we're doing it in a way that's easy to use, because sometimes it can be a bit clunky to solve that problem.
Well, yeah, makes sense. So I just want to move forward a little bit, Josh. And
Mhm.
we've obviously talked about obtaining consent, we've done a bit of recording and management as well. So just to highlight that. So part of the consent management lifecycle is obtaining consent, recording consent, managing consent. Now I just want to drop back into this. And the next part of it is actually enforcing consent. Now, when you showed me this sort of like a few weeks ago when we first spoke, enforcing consent, it just feels like a bit of a juxtaposition between the wordings there, enforcing consent. 'Cause it's like consent should be sort of like optional. What does it mean? I'm really confused by the whole enforcing consent. How does that even work?
Yeah, so so the language is quite directive when we use the phrasing of enforcing consent. But look, in essence, what we're trying to do is make sure that the end user, in as much as is described by the organisations that we work with, yeah, um, in essence, has clear and open access to the consent considerations that they need to have access to, right? So in essence, is to make sure you're not obfuscating, you're not hiding consent. Yeah. So we're making sure that there is an enforceable element here to be able to say, okay, you know, this needs to be actionable and visible and usable for the end user. So we're kind of enforcing the consent decision upon the end user to make that decision, right? Rather than hiding it in a little corner and saying, well, we did enough around consent,
Yes.
but we hid it down here on the bottom left hand side because we know actually maybe the basis of consent is you have to opt out. So you're already opted
Mm.
in. So if we hide it, and we don't try and enforce a decision, then we can get all the information we want. Happy days, right? We can tick a compliance box. We get all the information. It's a win-win for us. And actually, you're kind of screwing over the little guy by not giving him a clear, enforceable choice. The other way we also look at enforcement as well is more for our customers is, okay, how do we scan and identify what the current status of play is in terms of consent? Because sometimes a big problem is that massive organizations, one marketing department will have loads of vendors that they have to make up certain aspects of their site work. You'll have 20 or 30 different sites, maybe even hundreds of sites. So hundreds of different marketing departments, all coming up with different things that are unique to their site, which means that drops extra cookies, which means that's information that different vendors want or are trying to collect on you. And sometimes they just can't see the wood for the trees. They go, okay, what's going on here? Are we at risk? Do we need to declare what these vendors are? Because they have to be able to say and identify them, because sometimes they actually don't know. This is the weird bit, is they might not know that they have a cookie being dropped by Facebook, their site. They might just not be aware of it. Unlikely with Facebook, but I'm just going to use that example. And so from an enforcement perspective, what we try and do is make sure that they're actually identifying the vendors correctly, because legally that's what they're meant to do, right? Because that's what they will get enforced upon in terms of a fine is, oh, okay, we didn't realize that we missed these 20 other vendors because we used an auto scanning tool that gave them a color coding, which then didn't pick it up and actually add it to the cookie banner, which is the foible of some of sort of the first gen solutions that exist. And I missed it, and somebody's now complained to, I don't know, let's use the CNIL, which is the body in France, and I've now got a 120 million euro fine.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So there's two ways of enforcement. One is enforce the decision because the end user needs to make a choice.
Yep.
Because of legislation. And the other view of enforcement is, what can we do to protect you against punitive enforcement and action? What can we do to make sure that you're constantly evaluating your scenario, scanning for new vendors, and automatically allocating them in a way that is accurate, right?
Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense. And like you say, that's a bit clearer as opposed to it's enforced consent was, it was just I think it's just poor wording, because like you say, as soon as you mention that, look, it's just a way in which we can sort of highlight, look, this is what we're doing, rather than it being sneaky. Oh, it was in the fine print of the T's and C's, like, because then that would cause more uproar. Okay, cool, that makes perfect sense. So
Nick, just on that point, actually, something that's worth mentioning is the reason we think there should be, again, the word enforcement is more around making sure that the organizations are dedicated to making a almost a blocking format around consent of, we need to enforce a decision, something needs to happen here.
Yes.
The reason for making that decision and using quite strong language is there's actually a real focus on something called dark patterns, right? Okay. And we're seeing lots of organizations get in trouble for this is, when you make a decision to not enforce consent, to do like a soft consent with like a little pop-up you click at the bottom corner, and so there's no blocking format, dark patterns are where you are trying to obfuscate. We're trying to kind of be a bit deceptive. So it could be that you use language that sort of has like a double negative, like, do you not consent to not have consent? And you go, well, I'm not sure what that meant. I'll just click yes, right? So it's little nuances and things like that that are being sneaky, right? Tactics to get you to consent rather than just being truthful and just saying, I want to enforce the law, I want to do the right thing. And that's why we sort of use that strong terminology, if you will.
Yes. Yeah. No, really good point. Really good point. I'm glad that obviously you highlighted that as well. So just as we sort of enter the final parts of it then, so we've obviously got the more front end stuff that we discussed at the start, then sort of the giving the permission. The final part of it that you obviously mentioned at the start was, we need to show how proof of how the data is stored, and also if I want my data being removed or expiring or deletion, whatever it might be. Just kind of chunk down a little bit for me on that then. How do you kind of complete this final bit of the content management journey?
Yeah. So in essence, what we do is we focus on pretty much any consent configuration or change made. So what we're doing is we're picking up those events, right, from a technical perspective. So either a yes or a no, and then it's aligned to either a very prescriptive vendor or purpose when you're talking about cookies, or it's aligned to sort of more of a unique business terminology, i.e., do I consent to being marketed to for one of my sub brands, right? And so there's an event, and so we store that event against that specific consent, and we save that within an audit function that we have on our solution. So without an audit function, it's kind of useless. That's the primary defense against legislative bodies, is to say, look, here's a screenshot of the of the version of consent that I presented to the end user. Here's how it's stored, it's time stamped. I can even link it off to a downstream system to pull that information out so that I've got a repository separate. Now, in essence, what we're trying to do with collecting that record of consent is we want to create a unified consent journey. So this is one of the unique things that we offer, and as a provider, in essence, is what we're saying is you want to be able to have a repository for myself, let's say, yeah, as an end user, from that unidentified to identified journey about everything I've consented to on any device, anywhere, anytime, even offline. Even if I've spoken to somebody on the phone, I want a little voice note which is attached to my consent. There is a record of it somewhere, because most organizations will be running on the basis of having some sort of freemium element to their CRM system that takes consent, a binary opt-in or opt-out for marketing, email marketing, right? I get it all the time. I'm wearing Charles Tyrwhitt shirt. I get Charles Tyrwhitt emails, and it's just, do you want to opt in or opt out on the email embed, right? Really, you need to have a place for consent. You need to have the consent stored. You actually need to have it impartially stored as well, because that's another important element. That is, if I manage all of my own consents and I do it in a way that isn't encrypted and it isn't timestamped and it isn't done with a level of jurisprudence, is it fair? Is it trustworthy? When it comes to an audit, is it stored in the right way? Is it stored in a way that they consider to be of the correct standard for that region? And then do I do that for all the different regions, right? And all the different nuances in terms of data sovereignty and storage and things like that, the considerations that you have to take into mind. And then what that does mean is that if you've got a centralized repository of consent, right, of the consent record, not the data, but of the event of consent, yeah, it means that when it comes to painting that picture of, okay, what do I need to grab to put into a bucket to give back to then delete, yeah, at the moment, organizations will have a spreadsheet. Right, this is more often than not. They'll have a spreadsheet. They'll have, some sort of identifier, email address, an ID, or even just using the surname and some hashing, for example, to say, right, we need to get everything on this person. And what they'll do is they'll go and get all the information they can and dump it into one place without necessarily having a thread between what was consented for, what wasn't consented for. And what you find out is sometimes they present back information, and in that pot of information was stuff they didn't have consent for.
Okay.
And then they get in serious trouble because how long have they had it for? What other information have they collected on me? Do you see how that spirals out of control? So that gating of consent to make sure that you're only ever taking the right information in means that when they do reach that final maturity piece, that we help manage based on jurisdictional requirements of, you need to respond in X amount of time, you need to provide the information sort of to that individual in X format, etc., etc. Yeah. That's normally quite straightforward, by the way, that last piece, but it's normally about managing the time frame. What that means is that that you've got only consented information that's gone into your system. So when you do scrabbling around and bring that file back to send over to the end user, it means that you're not going to be caught out. You're not going to find that sort of embarrassing sort of head slap moment of, we've been collecting information that wasn't consented for 18, 19 months. And really, just sort of to top it all off, Nick, is that what I'm describing here is a unified view of consent, right? Is how do I manage consent from every single entry point for every single jurisdiction from start to finish in a way that is impartial, is trustworthy, and is flexible from a technical capability, because that's also a consideration of great. It covers me for consent, but does it play well with, Adobe, Google, Telium, etc., all these other solutions? So that's what we're trying to solve for, I think, within the space. And that is kind of the big problem that's going to present to everybody in the next 24 months. We're already having conversations about it with a lot of organizations. Is how do I deal with this complexity? I'm not a subject matter expert. What do I do? Can you help? We keep getting fined. Please help us, so on and so forth. So hopefully I've been able to convey what the sort of the clear steps are, and that, answering your question around, how do I store it? You need to store it impartially in a trustworthy way that's functionally suitable for both you and for your customers.
Fantastic. Great point. Really well summarized as well, because I know this is not easy to kind of do in literally like 20, 25 minutes. Look, I normally I would wrap it up, but I can't let you go without asking this last question. How's AI impacted your line of work? How has it affected consent management?
So this is a me response, not an
Oh,
Adobe
okay.
response.
Okay.
I'm super cynical
Okay.
about AI. The vast majority of it is just large language models. It's been around for ages. I think potentially, there is a lot it can do. That being said, I know, having spoken to our CEO recently, we are using AI in terms of building, right? We are using it internally. I think the efficiency side of things on a day-to-day basis are great. Do I think that AI is going to have a big say in our space? Yes. I'm also very much hoping it will, because I think that AI regulation is going to be the next really complicated thing to try and solve for in the privacy space. Where do we start? Don't know. I think there are some organizations that are attempting to do it. I think it's too early. What we kind of need to do is let it sit, let it rest, let AI become a thing properly in the sort of the zeitgeist, see where the areas and the problem areas are that need to be sort of smoothed out, clipped, put into a slightly more structured environment, and
Yes.
then go from there. But I think internally, we love it. Externally, I think let's wait and see. Let's see what the true ramifications are in the next coming weeks, months, and years.
Perfect, Josh. Look, thank you very much for joining me on the Security Space today. It has been really insightful. And look, if anybody has any questions for Josh or would like to learn more about the great work that Didomi do in the concept management space, I'll be sure to put all the information down below. But Josh, once again, thank you very much for coming on the Security Space podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Pleasure.